Okay, welcome everyone to the weekly conservation seminar. Today we have someone joining us from the Pacific Coast, Dr. Jocelyn Akins. She is the founder and conservation director of the Cascades Carnivore Project, a conservation science NGO based in Hood River, Oregon. She is a carnivore ecologist and conservation geneticist. Her doctoral research at University of California, Davis examined the genetic structure, habitat associations, and landscape genetic connectivity of an evolutionary distinct, rare, high elevation carnivore, the Cascade red fox. And this work led to an endangered species listing decision for this rare, little studied species. She has spent the past 15 years developing and leading collaborative carnivore studies throughout the Cascade Range, primarily focused on rare carnivores and mountain ecosystems. So with that, please welcome Dr. Jocelyn Akins. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box or hold them till the end. So I'll
Should I go?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that intro, Danny. Got a little spoiler alert in there. All right. Thanks everyone for joining us today. It's great to see everyone. A shout out to Dave Mack, if that's the real Dave Mack. You very much inspired my work. I've spent plenty of time in the Canadian Arctic and definitely follow in the footsteps of carnivore biologists like yourself. So thanks for being here. And I just wanted to acknowledge that this is not solely my research. The talk will largely be my story and how the research began and what we're doing. But we have some very strong partnerships with the National Park Service and the U.S. Forest Service, as well as the Department of Fish and Wildlife, where this work is also partnered with Washington State University and funded by many of those agencies and other foundations and groups. As Danny mentioned, I'm a conservation biologist, and I like to use the evidence that wild animals leave behind to understand the status and the health of populations from a genetic standpoint. I didn't come to this kind of came about organically. I was always very much interested in mountainous landscapes and carnivores, and I learned over time that using DNA was a really good tool to understand how these rare carnivore populations were doing. I mostly work in remote and wild mountain places. I just love to learn about species that are hard to find and are in these super rugged places. I grew up hiking in the Cascade Mountains from a very young age. This is me and my dad on Mount Baker in Washington State. I think my little sister is probably in the tent. Both my parents brought us in the mountains from a young age, and I really have a deep appreciation and love for wild mountainous places. And I've always been interested in carnivores since I was a teenager, and there were black bears roaming our suburban neighborhood of Vancouver, British Columbia. I became really interested in bears and bear biology. And about the mid 2000s, I started working on carnivore studies as a wildlife technician. This was after I earned my bachelor's degree in zoology from the University of British Columbia. And I've studied a few carnivore species. I've worked on grizzly bear population estimate in the Canadian Rockies. I went down to Belize for a bit and worked on a jaguar and ocelot project. I've spent some time in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem studying grizzly bears and black bears. And later I returned to Yellowstone to study wolverines, which is where I really got an interest and love for that species. About 15 years ago, I settled in Oregon and quickly fell in love with the people and the landscapes of the Columbia River Gorge. But I realized that there was not a carnivore job here waiting for me. There was work at the wind farms, there was work with salmon, but there just was not a lot going on for carnivore conservation biology work. And I just returned from that work in Yellowstone, where we trapped and collared wolverines. And when I landed back in Oregon, I learned about this photograph. So this was a wolverine that was detected on Mount Adams. It's the southernmost Cascade volcano in Washington. And this was totally outside of the official distribution of wolverines. The photograph was taken by the Confederated Bands and Tribes of Yakima Nation. Their reservation contains a portion of Mount Adams. And nothing was known about this wolverine. It was the only photo taken. And I was just totally curious, is this a dispersing male totally outside of its distribution? Or is this some, in my naivete and enthusiasm, an undetected population that nobody knew about? And for some reason, I just became enthralled with this wolverine and with wolverines in general and what this wolverine in particular represented. So I approached the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the wildlife biologist for the area, and he gave his approval to start a little research project. He gave me $500 and I got started. This effort eventually, 15 years later, it eventually became Cascades Carnivore Project. And this is who we are. We are a conservation science research organization, and we work to promote the conservation of carnivore species in the Cascade Range. And we do this through technical scientific research. We do it through community-based science and collaborations. So why do we care about wolverines in Washington? Well, really very little was known about wolverines in the lower 48. We knew that they'd been wiped out from large portions of their historical distribution, but where they occurred exactly and how well they were doing and what was preventing the recovery of this species was really not well studied 15 years ago. And as I mentioned, there was no carnivore research going on in Southern Washington, so there was really no handle of if there were more wolverines in the region, if their current distribution was expanding. And just a little, the work that I built my research upon was some work by Keith Aubrey and his collaborators. They did a deep dive into the distribution of verifiable observations of wolverines over time. And if you can just see so let me get my cursor here. So this is Washington on the top, Oregon detections, and this is the historical record of distributions of wolverines. And you can see by about 1920, wolverines had been wiped out from the Pacific Northwest. And there was this 70 years or so, this chunk of time where there were no detections of wolverines by any researchers or verifiable reports from the public. There was a little blip in the 1960s that is sort of not totally understood. But by about the 1990s, it appeared that wolverines were returning to Washington. This is the habitat suitability model for wolverines globally. It's based on wolverine dens that were amassed in a data set from around the globe. And you can see there is a lot of suitable wolverine habitat in Washington. And researchers, we developed a working group, and we started putting together verifiable observations of wolverines, whether it was from other research projects or from the public. And so by the end of the 1990s, this is a 5-year window of wolverine detections, and you can see there was basically no wolverine detections. There was not none. There was a few, and so it was sort of the start of a recolonization event. It appeared was going on, and it was really the kickoff for new research on wolverines in Washington. And then if you jump ahead, this is when the next 5-year window right here, 2000 to 2005, there was a few more detections. This one down here, this is Mount Adams, Mount Rainier is up there. And this is the Yakima Nation detection there that occurred in 2005. And things kind of picked up. I'm jumping ahead a decade here. You could see that wolverines were establishing themselves in the Washington Cascades. And just to reiterate, these are either research observations from researchers or from the public, but they're all verifiable. They're not tracks, they're genetic samples or photographs. So that with that Wolverine on Mount Adams, I kicked off sort of a tag team Wolverine project that was very small. And I basically recruited friends and we went out onto Mount Adams and started setting wildlife cameras. And we did it at a Wolverine home range scale. So we put them in Wolverine suitable habitat, and we did a systematic survey spaced at a Wolverine home range size. This is the setup we use. So it's just a typical camera survey station design with bait and then a hair snagging device so that we could get hair samples possibly and get a DNA sample. There's the hair snagger there. We would have a lure hanging in the tree, and we usually have 2 cameras. And this is what it looked like in real life. The carnivore would approach the bait, and ideally it would get its paws up on the tree, eat the bait, and leave some hair on the hair snaggers. This map shows the distribution of our stations. So the green are our current monitoring stations. And I know you guys, speaking to you guys in Minnesota, but just a little orientation. The red is I-90, which is the interstate that bisects Washington and cuts right through the Cascades. And our study area is the South Cascades down to the Columbia River, which is just below this Mount Adams wilderness a little ways. This is the Yakima Nation Reservation I mentioned. And the survey unit was 225 square kilometers. That's sort of the usual used area for wolverines these days. So the work is best, this carnivore research is really well done in the winter when food is limited. So most species are either hibernating or they've moved down into the valleys to avoid winter, but wolverines stay up high and they have a hard time surviving in these marginal habitats, and so they will respond really well to our bait. But winter makes for hard work, as many of you know. We would snowmobile as far as we could into the mountains, and then we would ski or snowshoe up from the Forest Service wilderness boundary. In the early days, I often did this on my own because there was no money to pay a field technician. And we would get all our cameras up at tree line, which is where we expected to find wolverines. And this video just shows sort of the conditions. This was a crazy winter storm that dropped 2 feet of snow overnight and then a foot while we were out there. And you can just see how slow going it all is. So as we set these stations, we were not getting wolverines. We were getting a bunch of different carnivores, and that was exciting and felt like the stations were working well. There's a suite of carnivores in the South Cascades, and includes black bears, cougars, coyotes, and bobcats, as well as some smaller carnivores. But a whole winter rolled around with no wolverine detections, and it actually took 15 months to get this first photograph. And we never knew if it was the same one that the Yakima Nation had detected, but we thought it probably was. And so we built on this study to monitor the return of wolverines to the South Cascades. Wolverines are making a comeback on their own. They're coming down from British Columbia or Alberta. There is genetic research going on to figure out where that colonization came from. And wolverines face many challenges. They're a mid-sized carnivore, and they, like I mentioned, they live in these high elevation marginal habitats in the winter in Washington. And they maintain these huge territories in order to find food that they need to survive. Just to remind you, wolverines are from one of the 5 terrestrial carnivore families in North America called the mustelids, and they're facultative scavengers. So they spend a lot of time looking for ungulate carcasses, but they'll also kill their own prey, and they eat a lot of other species, especially in the summer. They eat a lot of small mammals. Wolverines are intrepid. They live high in the Cascades of Washington and other rugged places, and those territories can be up to 400 square miles. There's been territories in Washington documented at that size. So it's a lot of ground to cover from a research perspective. And after we got that first wolverine detection, we started to get detections of wolverines throughout the South Cascades. But we were never really sure if these were all the same individual or if we were detecting multiple individuals. We thought that they probably were. We ended up getting good photographs at times, but we could never be 100% sure that we hadn't missed a new individual. And so in about 2015, we adopted a new survey method, and this was designed by Audrey McGowan. She's a wolverine expert from Alaska. And she developed this station called the Wolverine Run Pole, or the Wolverine Integrated Monitoring Station. And it's pretty cool because it does three things. It detects a wolverine and identifies it based on the unique chest blaze that each individual wolverine has. It's a white pattern on its chest. It also collects hair samples. Here we have these gun brushes, or these wire brushes, that allow us to collect a hair sample. So then we could also verify the wolverine's identity based on genetics. And the third thing that it does is that it can determine, or it can let us know if it's a female or a male wolverine, and also the reproductive status, like is it a reproducing female? This is what the setup looks like in the field. So in the Cascades, the snowpack is about 12 to 16 feet in the winter. And so we set the station up at the lichen line on the tree. So where maximum snowpack is, that's where the station goes. And it allows the station to run all winter without being buried. You can see we have this piece of bait here. So the wolverine climbs the tree and it comes out on the run pole. It passes through the gun brushes and it gets out, and there's a little metal bar here. And so it can put its paws on the bar and reach for the bait. And then a camera over here, which Scott is setting, will take photographs as the wolverine is out on the run pole. So it's a pretty cool design. It works really well. It takes a little bit to set up, but then once it's there, it can do a lot to learn about wolverines, collect data. These are the gun brushes. So here's another photo of the landscape that we are working in. As I mentioned, it's a 225 square mile survey unit that we put each of these stations in. So we look across this landscape and we find landscape features that might funnel wildlife, and we try to set them in areas like that. This is our 6th winter, starting up right now in October, deploying these stations, and we have 28 of them across the South Cascades. So this is very much a monitoring program looking at the return of wolverines to Washington. What we're trying to understand is how the population is growing and which portions of the landscape are important for it, and what happens to is the reproduction and what happens to the offspring over time. These are a couple of photos from our station. So you can really see that the chest blaze of the two of different wolverines are distinct. And so we know that this individual, this male here, is different from this one over here. And here in the red box, you see this female wolverine's teats. So then we knew that she was a reproductive mother, and we could follow up and try to, and we would set cameras to see around the run pole, like at maybe a half-kilometer distance, to see if we could detect her offspring. Just wanted to give a shout out. This was our early field crew. They ended up getting married, and you can see wolverines on their wedding cake, but they were instrumental in helping to document the first wolverine den in the South Cascades in a very long time. And here is footage of that female on the last slide, Pepper, and her offspring at their den. So we were able to show that wolverines had established the reproduction in the South Cascades. And this is the den in May. It's wolverines dig down through the snowpack, and they don't dig into the ground. They give birth and have kits on the ground in some kind of structure. And this is what the structure looked like when we came back. So it's pretty neat. So snowpack is about, as I mentioned, 12 plus feet. And the female digs down through that snowpack in February, March, and somehow knows that there's this structure. The wolverine den was back. This was the entrance here. I mean, you can just see it's this total fortified place for her to reproduce. So the detection of that female reproducing was very exciting, because 1 decade after we had detected the wolverine on Mount Adams, we detected this female and showed that there was reproduction. But it was a slow period to find that evidence. However, a couple of years later, in 2020, we detected a second female. We nicknamed her Joni. She was detected in Mount Rainier National Park. And early in 2020, we confirmed that she was also reproducing. So you can see, it's hard to see, but you can see these are her teats, and that she was indeed a female, and she had a litter as well. This was the first litter in Mount Rainier National Park in over a century. And she came to one of our survey stations that we set. So this is just a ground station we set when we think there's a reproducing female and we want to document reproduction. Here is Joni. We saw her once in the study area, which is pretty neat. So Joni was a new individual in the study area. And also in that same year, in 2020, we documented another male in the Goat Rocks Wilderness, so north of Mount Adams and south of Mount Rainier. This individual stuck around for a summer, and then he was gone. So it's very much an unstable, very small population that's establishing itself. We haven't seen wolverines on Mount Adams for over 8 years, but a member of the public shared this track. So we're hopeful that there's still wolverines on the landscape, but it's such a small population that it's hard for individuals to stick around and find a mate. We were curious if Joni would reproduce again. We first documented that reproduction in 2020, and she's gone on to reproduce every year since then, including this year. She had triplets. So she's produced 9 offspring in 4 years, which is quite interesting because wolverines don't typically reproduce every year. And so we think this is a testament to the quality of the habitat at Mount Rainier. So this is what wolverine habitat looks like in the summer. It's really the landscape around tree line that is important for wolverines in the Pacific Northwest. It's a place where they forage for voles and gophers in subalpine meadows, and they scare up snowshoe hares in copses of subalpine trees, like you can see here. They hunt for marmots and pika and talus slopes, and for mountain goats at the base of cliffs and avalanche chutes. So we continue to monitor this small population, and we're expanding our study area to understand how wolverines are affected by climate change and where they can find refuge across this mountainous landscape. All right, I'm going to shift gears to another species we studied, the Cascade red fox. So all this time that we were looking for wolverines and getting very few results, we were detecting this little fox at a lot of the stations. So it was the depth of winter. We were setting stations at tree line, like I mentioned, and this landscape can be totally white and barren up in the mountains after a snowstorm. It just feels like there's no life up there. You don't see any tracks. And it just seems amazing that any species can survive. There's just a really small prey base. And yet these little red foxes were regularly visiting our camera stations. And at this time, I was sending genetic samples to the University of California, and I ended up starting graduate work there. And my work focused on this mountain fox called the Cascade Red Fox. And I collected some hair and scat samples, and I wanted to do a population health, like status update of how many foxes there were, what the genetic diversity and connectivity of the population was like. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about the Cascade Red Fox because it's a really little known species. So the Cascade Red Fox is one of the rarest mammals in North America, but this really wasn't known. They were a very unknown species in the United States. When I began surveys on Mount Adams, there was little known about their ecology, and so it was a pretty good graduate study. The only study of the Cascade Red Fox had been conducted from 1978 to 1983 by Dr. Keith Aubrey, and this was done at Mount Rainier. So when I started my research, there'd been about a 30-year period where no research had been done. And I'm going to tell you the story of the Cascade Red Fox. So here is Keith Aubrey doing his research in the 1970s. And I just want to read a quote that he told me once. This is what he said, quote, "I began my field work running remote cameras, movies that I took, 16 mil frames, each 10 minutes or something, a stunningly primitive methodology to say the least." And in 1978, Keith was looking for foxes around Seattle. This is what he said: "This is dense coniferous forest, not what we know today to be Cascade Red Fox habitat, which is subalpine parkland and habitats above and below tree line." So what's kind of interesting about that is that there was just really no understanding of these foxes up in the mountains. And Keith told me that I'm going to quote him again, wasted a field season working around Seattle and found no evidence of foxes whatsoever. And so he decided to move his study to Mount Rainier. He said, "After going about a month, I was taking a walk as the sun was going down, and I saw a Cascade Red Fox standing on the trail in the silver forest at sunrise." So that's a trail in Mount Rainier National Park. And he says, quote, "It was a revelation as it proved to me that I was finally working in the right place and that Cascade Red Foxes weren't extinct." So this just shows you how little was known about them. And this is the fox that we detected and that was photographed by a wildlife photographer that we've partnered with. And this is taken in the same place, that silver forest at Mount Rainier. And Keith, he spent 3 years studying the Cascade Red Fox at Mount Rainier and recognized that red foxes occurred in the high mountains of the Western United States, but not in the Canadian Rockies or in most of Canada. And he began digging into the red fox fossil record and the archaeological record. He also noticed that the mountain foxes were small. They were smaller than larger red foxes in the boreal forest of Canada and the northeastern United States. And he developed this hypothesis to explain their evolutionary history. And he told me this story, and he became my mentor, and I began to learn about how unique and interesting the Cascade Red Fox is. But it's really a complicated story. So the red fox, I like to say, it has a bum rap. It's the trickster, it's the chicken killer. It's in children's stories, and people often persecute them in real life. But the red fox, it has an omnivorous diet and an innate curiosity. So it really has this like sly predator reputation. And also another thing is that it's ubiquitous. It's found around the globe. There's 50 subspecies. And it lives in many habitats, from grasslands to jungle to tundra. The IUCN considers it a species of least concern, which means that it's globally abundant and widespread. So this is all the context of how this species was overlooked. But in North America, there are 3 subspecies of red fox that live at high elevation in the mountains of the American West, in the Cascades, in the Sierra Nevada, and in the Rocky Mountains. And they're distinct morphologically, genetically, and ecologically from all other red foxes. And the Cascade red fox, it only lives in the Cascade Range of Washington and mainly from Mount Adams to Mount Rainier. So Keith Aubrey had a unique theory about how the mountain foxes evolved. He came up with this idea in the early 1980s, and it was later supported through DNA analyses by him and his collaborators in a new paper that came out in 2009. So their history is that they colonized North America in 2 waves of migration across the Bering Land Bridge. And so when the continental ice sheets occurred and sea level was low, and the Bering Land Bridge connected what's now Russia to North America, red foxes migrated into North America for the first time. This was the Illinoisan glaciation. And when those glaciers melted and the Bering Land Bridge when the Bering Strait reestablished and the 2 continents were not connected anymore, red foxes became isolated on separate continents. So there was red foxes in North America, and then there was a barrier of the ocean, and there was red foxes left in Eurasia. And then during the last ice age, the Wisconsin Ice Age, the Bering Land Bridge reformed and a second wave of foxes migrated into North America. And during this time, the ancestors of the mountain foxes, they were pushed south of the ice sheets into these really cold, sparse, treeless plains of Western and Central United States. And they adapted for about 100,000 years to this cold glacial climate. And when the Wisconsin ice sheets melted and receded to the poles, the foxes that had adapted to this cold glacial climate, they moved up into the mountains, into the Cascades, the Sierra Nevada, and the Rocky Mountains. So that second wave of foxes, they are the ancestors of lowland foxes, probably foxes that you have in Minnesota, foxes in the Canadian boreal forest, and on the East Coast. And beginning in the late 1800s, foxes were brought west. So there was no lowland foxes in Washington in the 1800s, but then they were brought from the East Coast for fur farming and for hound hunting. And over time, these lowland red foxes were released or escaped from captivity. And their descendants are now living as non-native red foxes in many parts of the West. But the Cascade red foxes, they live on the upper slopes of the Cascade volcanoes and other high elevation sites, and they do not leave the subalpine zone, even in the harshest blizzards of winter. They're up there, and they don't interbreed with lowland foxes because they're separated geographically. And one theory is that they live at high elevation to avoid competition and predation with coyotes. Coyotes are known to be a major competitor and source of predation for red foxes in low elevation populations. And just the context of the 3 mountain fox subspecies, the Rocky Mountain red foxes, they live on the expansive Rocky Mountain plateau. So there's more habitat for them there, but in the Cascades and in the Sierra Nevada, their habitat is really limited to this zone around the Cascade volcanoes. So this is Mount Adams up here, and this is really the heart of where the foxes live. And you can see it's just like a donut around each volcano. It's not a lot of habitat. So they are naturally low density. And for reasons that we fully don't understand yet, foxes are persisting in the southern portion of Washington, but they're largely wiped out from the North Cascades ecosystem of Washington. Many carnivores are not doing well for historical reasons around predator control programs, habitat fragmentation. So these carnivores are all recovering, and they occur in low numbers. And carnivores need large landscapes that are connected to roam and find mates. And that is probably one of the biggest challenges for both wolverines and Cascade red foxes. It's been tricky to figure out how many foxes remain and where the population persists. We were able to, through my graduate work, we did a genetic analysis to show that the effective population size of the foxes in the South Cascades is less than 20 individuals, their genetic effective population size. And so we know that they're a very small inbred population, and ultimately their persistence is going to require recovery actions to reconnect them across their habitat. So in order to improve this genetic diversity, we either need to connect populations and increase gene flow, or we need to have more individuals in the population. So just a few things that threaten foxes. These are hypotheses we're testing to figure out what is driving their current decline. The subnivean zone here, this illustration, it shows you where there's prey for foxes in the winter. However, with climate change, there's more there's more rain events on the snowpack in the winter than we normally get in the Northwest. And so this rain on snow, after the temperature drops down again, then it creates this ice layer on top of the snowpack. And that does two things. It reduces the insulating value of the subnivean, and it also reduce, and so that causes increased prey mortality in the subnivean, and it also reduces access because the wolverines can't get into the subalpine zone. Foxes also hunt for prey on the snow, so largely snowshoe hares and Douglas squirrels. And those prey, they find shelter in these stands of high elevation mature conifers, and you can see there's a lot of mortality of the white bark pines in Washington subalpine. There's a disease called blister rust, which is caused by, or tree death is caused by stress, heat stress, and it's we're really losing a lot of conifers in the alpine. So the combination of their low numbers in genetic diversity that we were able to show and the predicted impacts of climate change led to Washington deciding to list the species as endangered last year. And so we've begun new and challenging work to understand really what is driving this decline. And the way we're doing that is that we're looking at the impacts of climate change on this species from a food habits perspective. So we're using DNA metabarcoding to do a couple of things to identify which prey, the breadth of prey that foxes eat, and then what are the key prey? What are the most important prey? And are those prey climate sensitive? Are they marmots and pikas that are also affected by climate change? And so we're trying to see what the drivers of this decline are. And I realize I'm running out of time here, and I just wanted to introduce our link study, but I'm going to go over it really briefly so there's time for questions. But we have started a new genetic study that really is a model from our Cascade red fox work. And so lynx are also a very rare species in Washington. They think there could be as few as 30 females left in Washington, but nobody is doing an abundance estimate to understand how many there actually are. A lot of the work is focused around modeling the habitat, and there's incredible research going on. But we sort of accidentally came across a wolverine, it's mixing up all my species, a lynx data set. And so we took our fox work, which is looking at their diet and how their key prey species are impacted by climate change, and we're doing a study to look at all carnivores in the North Cascades ecosystem to see how they partition food between different species. And through this work, we collected 1,000 scats, and it turned out that 300 of these were lynx, which we were very surprised because they're such a rare species. And so we intensively surveyed the North Cascades. We collected scats along trails, and we recorded the kilometers of trail that we hiked. So we had an effort metric, and we were able to understand who eats what and see how they're partitioning food. Many of you are probably familiar with metabarcoding. So we get the sequence of all the prey items in the carnivore's scat, and then we can build out models to understand which prey are most important. This is a little bit of a hard map to decipher, but it basically just shows the proof of concept that we were able to successfully collect lynx scats. And all these colors over here, these are the genotypes of individual lynx. So it's kind of a bit of a blob, but it just goes to show that there are still lynx in Washington. And these are the places they are, just to describe them. The colorful dots are lynx individuals. The purple triangles are lynx sequences. So we know they're lynx, but we're just waiting for the genotyping results. And then the black squares, they show effort, places where we collected carnivore scats, but they weren't lynx. And then the blue is just showing filling in our data set. This was our 2023 samples that we have yet to send to the lab. But we ended up detecting 64 lynx from this data set. So managers were thinking there could be as few as 40 in the state, that they were just on their way to extinction. And so we are now working to build this out into an actual population estimate to show what's going on with lynx in Washington. And sorry, I'm just wrapping up. I really just touching on the lynx, but I want to give time for questions. But so we are studying these 3 carnivore species. There is the returning wolverines are just the tip of the iceberg of this new population, and we're monitoring to see how that goes over time. And then with the listing of the Cascade red fox, there's a lot more interest in understanding how to recover that species. So we're working with Yakama Nation and with the University of Washington to collar foxes and see what their fine scale habitat use looks like. How much do they rely upon subalpine mammals versus snowshoe hares? Really, what are the important prey sources, and how are those prey populations doing? And then for the lynx, we're looking at numbers and how, and I didn't mention this actually, but how we have samples from British Columbia to look at how lynx are connected with southern British Columbia as a distinct subpopulation that might be separate from the core continental boreal lynx distribution. So thanks so much, and I have to take questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, please either unmute yourself if you're brave enough, or drop them in the chat. We'll give people a moment to get them in, and we already have one in. So Bridget Tim is wondering, do wildfires or forestry practices play a large role in where the wolverines will occur?
Yeah, so we have a lot of wildfire in Washington. We've lost a lot of habitat on Mount Adams. There hasn't been a lot of research on how wolverines are affected by wildfire, but there is a lot of research on how lynx habitat is being lost, and it's logical that wildfire also affects Cascade red foxes. But it's a major concern for the conservation of all 3 of those species. And I think wolverines are possibly more resilient to wildfire because their territories are larger, so they can move into other portions of them. And also a lot of the fires occur at mid elevations. An interesting thing is that Mount Rainier is it's right on the Cascade crest, and it receives a lot of rain from the Pacific Ocean. And so it has been more resilient to wildfire than east slopes, which is what foxes and lynx prefer.
Awesome. I have a quick question, if that's all right. So on the timeline history, it looked like from 1961 to 1970, there was a detection of 10 wolverines in that time period, which seems like a lot. And I was just wondering, do you think that's due to just like an ramp of detection, of people working to detect wolverines, or was it something to do with colonization more so?
Yeah, people think, research experts think it was the latter, and there was I'm not sure of all the details, but there was it was at the top of the snowshoe hare cycle, and it seems like there was some kind of coming together of individual wolverines and then the prey supporting them. But it's a really confounding piece of the story. But in the 1960s, there was nothing had changed methodologically, but there was a surge of wolverines, but they did not persist. They didn't stick around into the 70s, 80s, and they didn't show up again until the 90s.
Interesting. Yeah, we have about 10 more minutes for questions. Okay, here we go. From Colleen, did wolverines used to live in the Great Lakes region?
Okay. Okay, I'm Canadian, so my Minnesota and Great Lakes geography is not totally solid, but Michigan is the Wolverine state, as you guys know. There was one Wolverine in Michigan in the early 2000s, and it's unclear if it was part of if Michigan and the Great Lakes was part of their historical distribution. There's no record of them being in Michigan, but then this wolverine showed up in 2000. But on the north side of the lakes in Ontario, there is definitely a population of wolverines. And yeah, up into Quebec and like as the boreal forest goes north. But
From Smith Freeman, would you say more about how wolverines hunt mountain goats?
oh, sure. There's been research showing that mountain goats make up to 70% of lynx, oh my goodness, of wolverine diet in certain populations, and it's largely thought to be from carcasses. So it's a really rugged landscape, and mountain goats do fall off cliffs. They get swept in avalanches, and the wolverines are able to find them. Wolverines, like, they do have a good sense of smell. It's not as good as maybe some people think it is, but what they do is they just roam their territory. They do a circuit of their huge territory, and they come across these carcasses at the bottom of avalanche chutes. And I think they know to, just to keep coming and checking out these spots within their territory.
I have a question along the lines of that a little bit on how wolverines know the structures underneath the snow are there. You kind of touched on this a little bit, but I was wondering if you can speak to it a little bit more for their denning.
Yeah, I have no idea. It's a totally interesting thing that wolverines really use snow. So they use snow for protection of their kits in the den, and then they use snow to cache the food that they find, so that it lasts and they can come. And this is especially important for females. The female is really, she's not provisioned by the male, and she's really stuck close to her den once she gives birth. So she caches food that she finds before she gives birth, and the snow refrigerates it. But as far as the dens go, we really don't know. We wonder if there's scenting going on in the summer, but you can presume that she knows her territory and she finds the place. But it's really interesting question, because it's absolutely just white and rolling snowy landscape, and yet she dug down to that really complex structure.
Wow, yeah, that's really interesting. Huh. Dave is wondering, are there no fissures in the Cascades?
Great question. Yeah, Fisher were totally wiped out. Their story is very similar to the Wolverine. They really were overtrapped. Their pelt is very soft and thick. And in the early 2000s, fishers have been reintroduced to Washington in 3 reintroduction projects. And so they are back. Yeah. And it's kind of neat because fishers they did not make it back on their own, whereas the wolverine did. So it just shows you that wolverines are. We know that the wolverine colonization event was from either British Columbia or Alberta. And all of the individuals that we've detected, they're all haplotype C. So they're all coming from the north. They're not coming from Idaho or Montana or Wyoming. And they're looking at their genetic relationships. We also know that the colonization happened from the north. But fishers, just the nearest population is in Canada, it's in British Columbia as well, and they never made it back.
Do you see any multi-species interactions above the tree line of these carnivores? I'm at like the resources just seem so scarce that maybe there's a lot of competition.
Yeah, I was just reading a paper from the Yukon about lynx and wolverine on a carcass, and the wolverine pushed off the lynx. So I've been curious what the foxes think about wolverines back on the landscape. Their habitat is just very similar. Their habitat needs are really quite similar. So they definitely co-occur. And but I suspect that wolverines are just going to push these smaller mesocarnivores off of carcasses. We haven't documented anything though.
Guy is wondering, are coyotes an increasing threat to Cascade foxes with climate change?
Yes. So this is a big question too, that we're trying to disentangle. So the gray wolf was wiped out from Washington by 1920. And the coyotes expanded as it has across North America. And part of that expansion is they do really appear to be moving up into the mountains. It's unclear what that pattern of colonization into the mountains is. We see them on our cameras in the winter. I think it's not in the heart of winter, but on the shoulder season of winter when it's still totally winter, but not in the really deep snow part of the winter. So it's a major concern. And especially with that rain on the snow, it's making it easier to move across to get into the mountains. The foxes are adapted to this thick snow like a lynx is. And so they're able to hunt. And it's unclear how successful coyotes are. But this new trapping study is aimed at, we're creating a coyote use surface that we can model our fox movement data on and see what the relationship looks like. But it's one of the main hypotheses is that coyotes are competing now in a habitat that the fox has carved out that's really marginal in terms of food availability.
Okay. Unless someone has a last minute question, really quick.
I actually have one, if you don't mind, if I'll just ask it here to save some typing. First of all, great talk, Jocelyn.
Thanks, Mike.
Concerning the wolverines, the high reproductive rate with Joni, I believe it was, reproducing every year. As you noted, that's rare. And my understanding is that in southern population of wolverines in Sweden, I think the annual reproductive rate is like 90%. So a lot of females are reproducing every year, or at least many years.
Yeah.
They sort of contribute that to high availability of food, a lot of ungulate subsidies from hunters and other carnivores. What is it about that area that Joni was in that could have contributed to that?
Yeah, I'm familiar with that Swedish work too. We do have hunting, but not like on that scale of the gut piles in Sweden. It's possible there's just little competition still. It is certainly, the habitat is not fully occupied by any stretch. But the park it has a lot. I mean, we don't know. There's no research done on prey populations. But there's clearly, Mount Rainier is a really intact ecosystem. There's very little roads that are breaking up the landscape. And then as I mentioned, like wildfires and taking out prey populations, and it's not shutting down portions of the habitat. It's not removing portions of suitable habitat. So that could be part of it too.
Yeah, and then just a real quick follow-up. So it seems like the main limitation then is having probably not habitat, but just having enough wolverines there. Do you guys have any idea how many wolverines could potentially be supported in that area?
No.
Ideas, is there an idea to potentially reintroduce them at some point, or?
Yeah, there hasn't been talk in Washington to reintroduce wolverines. It is discussed in California. I think one of the biggest thing is connecting the habitats. So there has been overpasses built on I-90, and now it's just a matter of are the wolverines going to use that we are seeing. I think this is sort of climate change is always a really big threat that we focus on, but we're losing a lot of wolverines to vehicle collisions. And so like creating safe passage for them, they can't seem to get out of our study area safely. To find a mate, like they just keep traveling. And so, yeah, I think reintroduction is probably a good idea. I mean, you could really establish a population down here if you just had a bit more genetic diversity, but it's not on the books right now.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. And I think that will close our seminar for this week. Thank you all for joining us. And thank you so much, Dr. Akins, for giving a great presentation.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.